Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today, we'll be looking at a 2020 remake of one of the all-time classic Universal monster horror films and famous sci-fi tales of yesteryear. It's the story of a young woman who, after escaping from a dangerous and abusive relationship, is understandably surprised when her spouse's sudden death leaves her with a wealth of inheritance. And while police begin to garner suspicion about this surviving victim and her own mental state, this survivor would begin to describe haunting experiences, claiming to be stalked by some sort of unseen figure. And while the case would progress, resulting in a grisly public murder, police begin to question whether or not this survivor, complete with her paranoid ghost stories, may not be as innocent as she initially seemed. I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is The Invisible Man. It's January 15th, 2020, and in sunny San Francisco, California, local police respond to the discovery of an apparent suicide at the upscale Mateo Palace Hotel. Police reports indicate that a housekeeper at the hotel discovers a deceased male in one of the rooms, and as media would reveal, this deceased party is identified as a high-profile tech mogul. The surprising discovery of 38-year-old tech entrepreneur Adrian Griffin's body sends shockwaves throughout the tech industry and media. Griffin had most recently been featured in various news outlets for his extensive contributions in the field of optics research and design. After failing to make contact with his brother and future person of interest Tom Griffin, Adrian was already in the midst of a police investigation as to his own whereabouts at the time of his death. But the news of his sudden passing and the circumstances surrounding his death would prove to be a shocking conclusion to the entrepreneur's own legacy. Though as the case would progress, it would even more surprisingly prove to be possibly the least shocking element of the case overall. Now, Adrian Griffin was well known at the time as a breakthrough research and development technician in the field of optics, pioneering a $2 billion tech venture with his self-made company OptiPro. While no official autopsy was performed at the request of his surviving sibling and legal representative Tom Griffin, which would later prove to be a giant red flag in the case, Adrian was determined to have died from extensive blood loss as the result of self-inflicted wounds to his person. And while Adrian's death is initially deemed non-suspect, the events that would follow begin to showcase a darker history to the tech mogul's own personal life, culminating in a murder and kidnapping investigation that would prove both disturbing and technologically fascinating at the same time. Now, as we dive into the complex and twisted narrative of the case itself, the investigation would technically begin with an unofficial police statement provided by Griffin's surviving spousal partner, Cecilia Cass. This surviving victim had been in a relationship with Griffin for a period of about 3 years, and on the surface, their dynamic seemed to be that of a healthy and prosperous one. They attended charity events together, they shared a highly secured and luxurious oceanfront mansion property, and word had actually begun circulating among Adrian's friends that they might have actually been trying to start a family. But underneath the surface of this facade was a much darker truth that this so-called perfect relationship was anything but. In statements provided in private to both her sister and future victim Emily Cass, as well as her friend and confidant San Francisco police detective James Lanier, Cecilia alleges that her boyfriend was both mentally and physically abusive to her over the entire course of their relationship, the extremes of which were so disturbing that it would eventually cause Cecilia herself to brazenly flee the confines of this seemingly perfect oceanfront property, or perhaps prison from her own perspective, in order to escape her abusive partner. And while this brave escape from the hands of her abuser would find her in the care of her aforementioned friend, James Lanier, the events that follow cast some suspicion surrounding Adrian's own death, and raise some questions about the mental state of Cecilia Cass herself, and whether or not her various claims can even be trusted. Initial signs of what police investigators, including Detective James Lanier, would attribute to intense mental and emotional turmoil begin to first manifest in the late hours of the night at the Lanier residence and future crime scene located at 128 Mansfield Street in San Francisco. Now, witnesses at the Lanier home reported being woken to screams, only to discover a manic Cecilia Cass suffering from what seemed to be some sort of a psychotic episode. Records indicate that Cecilia was apparently suffering from what initially seemed like micro-hallucinations, that she had allegedly seen inanimate objects shifting around the room or footprints and depressions appearing in furniture. And medical experts and authorities at the time believe this first of many episodes to be the result of her no doubt extensive trauma that she's experienced. Now, in what would later become a major point of contention in the case, particularly in the motive of the actual killer and assailant, Adrian Griffin left a large portion of his wealth and fortune to Cecilia herself, rumored to be to the tune of millions of dollars. And when coupled with the psychological unraveling of Cecilia Cass, initial critics of Cecilia's bizarre claims, which we'll get to shortly, instead cast the surviving victim as someone who may not have been as trustworthy in her recent claims as it might have initially seemed. In addition to her mental state, Cecilia's physical demeanor also notably declined, as noted by medical records and witness statements from those who knew her at the time of the case investigation. This includes during a job interview at the prominent Ruler architect firm in San Francisco, during which Cecilia fainted at some point during this routine interview process. Now, subsequent medical reports indicate that she had been either using or possibly abusing diazepam, theorized by medical advisors to have been used as an attempt to quell her anxiety and recent mental spells. It's noted that Detective Lanier actually did recover diazepam from his home, at which Cecilia Cass had been residing during the investigation itself, which is actually also heavily criticized given that she had a direct relationship with the detective involved in the case. But statements indicate that Cecilia herself denied actually taking the medication, suggesting instead that she might have actually been somehow drugged. And it's here that the case would take a turn for the more bizarre, as statements from Detective Lanier indicate that surviving victim Cecilia Cass offers a controversial theory of her own, that her abuser Adrian Griffin is in fact still alive, and that he somehow found a way to become completely invisible. Now, to press pause here for a second, it's not difficult to see how those with intimate involvement with the case would have found Cecilia's claims to be completely unreasonable, including that of her closest friend and sister, Emily. At this point, she seemingly descended into some kind of mental spiral, and according to then reports, Adrian Griffin was confirmed dead by both police and news outlets. And further to this, the mere suggestion that Griffin was somehow stalking her as an almost invisible man seemed like something out of a science fiction story. Now, these claims would also eventually be used to support theories of Cecilia's instability, and eventually even accuse her of murder, resulting in her eventual incarceration. Only the murder victim in question wouldn't be that of her departed spouse. The tragic murder of victim Emily Cass famously takes place in a very public setting, resulting in numerous witnesses who were able to offer subsequent incriminating statements to police as a result. Records show that Emily was scheduled to meet her sister Cecilia at the upscale Yulon restaurant in downtown San Francisco for dinner reservations. Sometime shortly after 8 p.m., patrons in the restaurant alert local authorities to the scene via numerous calls to 911 dispatch, where, upon investigators' arrival, they discover the body of Emily Cass. Now, crime scene photographs reveal that she was found still sitting at a dining room table, where her throat had been slashed with a straight-bladed weapon discovered at the scene of the crime itself. Extensive witnesses interviewed by police confirmed that Cecilia was seen with the murder weapon in hand, which was later discovered to be a simple kitchen knife, and that she appeared to be an obvious culprit in the murder in question. Now, a waiter at the prominent restaurant reported to police that Cecilia herself seemed very upset at the time leading up to the killing, and appeared extremely disheveled and visibly uneasy. And by the time authorities arrive at the scene, the implication is quite clear. Cecilia Cass is literally holding the murder weapon in question, and once again, appearing in a state of mental confusion. Now, police ultimately arrest and incarcerate Cecilia in preparation to charge her for her sister's violent murder. But before formal charges can be laid, however, she's first admitted to a local psychiatric facility for cautionary observation. And it's here that the case would take another truly unexpected turn. Police interviews with Cecilia Cass from within the hospital itself implicate her in the crime, including references to a violent email she had allegedly sent her sister in the days prior to the murder taking place, and quite alarmingly, also indicated that she wished her own sister to be dead within said emails. The evidence here, coupled with Cass's own statements and claims that Adrian Griffin was somehow physically stalking her despite his recent death, lead police to further believe that she has at this point had a complete mental collapse, culminating somehow in an act of violence with fatal consequences. Now, interview records show that Cecilia abhorrently denied all of these charges, instead once again defaulting to the murder, as well as the recent string of her own outbursts as the result of her invisible stalker, Adrian Griffin. In fact, claims here even go so far as to say that she was physically assaulted by this invisible man within the confines of Detective Lanier's own home at some point during the investigation. And while it could be possible, given that she was staying there for an extended period of time, this event couldn't actually formally be corroborated due to the fact that there were no other witnesses at the time of this alleged attack. And due to her fragile mental state, coupled with her own seemingly psychotic and paranoid theories, Cecilia Cass is ordered to be monitored under medical supervision for the time being. Though her incarceration wouldn't last long, and the case itself, as well as the truth behind Cecilia's own claims, was about to come crashing to an unbelievable conclusion. Cecilia Cass was able to escape the confines of the hospital in a violent and brazen escape, resulting in the assault of 6 local police on site, as well as a hospital orderly security guard, who all suffered non-fatal injuries. Only, as witness statements would later indicate, the assailant in question was actually not Cecilia Cass herself. It's during this daring escape that undeniable evidence would finally present itself, not only exonerating suspect Cecilia Cass in recent events, but also confirming the existence of this seemingly invisible stalker. Witness statements taken from those assaulted at the hospital confirm that numerous officers and security on site came face to face with what they could only describe as some kind of a shape within the hallways of the hospital itself. Now, this shape was described as an almost rubber-suited individual covered head to toe in some kind of a costume of some sort that concealed not only their identity, but also, albeit periodically, their own physically manifested appearance. Now, these descriptors also seem to match, at least in part, the previously criticized and dismissed claims from Cecilia Cass herself, in that her alleged perpetrator also appeared almost invisible at times, and the truth and scientific evidence behind these claims would soon be revealed. Cecilia would ultimately escape the facility armed with a stolen firearm that ballistics note she discharged multiple times during her venture, though miraculously the hospital staff and security remained unharmed in the process. She's ultimately located at what would be the final crime scene in the remarkable case, where police are able to finally formally identify the masked and costumed assailant in question. Police respond to 911 calls of a possible domestic disturbance and gunfire coming from a residence at 128 Mansfield Street, the household belonging to a local police officer and noted friend of the victim, James Lanier. Upon their arrival, they find the detective as well as his teenage daughter, both alive but injured, the victims of a violent assault at the hands of the killer. And quite shockingly, escaped patient and murder suspect Cecilia Cass is also present at the crime scene, though evidence discovered here would ultimately absolve her of all police suspicion in the case itself. Victim statements indicate that both Detective Lanier and his daughter were attacked by the invisible man, who viciously assaulted them before being ultimately subdued by the aforementioned Cecilia Cass. And this time, this claim of an almost spectral force is more than just a theory or a possible suggestion. There's now undeniable physical evidence that this invisible assailant exists, and it comes in the form of his own recovered corpse. This now deceased costumed killer in the case is formally identified by police as none other than Adrian's own younger brother, Tom Griffin. He was found dead in the hallway of the Lanier home, having been killed by 4 bullet wounds to his center mass that were fired from Detective Lanier's own pistol that was discovered at the scene of the crime. It was confirmed that Cecilia Cass herself was the one who discharged the firearm after discovering the brutal assault taking place on her friends, and as such, her swift actions may have actually saved their lives. Now, at this point, I'm sure there's no doubt questions about how exactly Tom Griffin managed to get away with these crimes, undetected for a long period of time, and specifically how he managed the seemingly impossible task of rendering himself completely invisible. Now, the answer here lies within the suit that he was found to have been wearing at the time of his death. Only in order to get further clarity on these answers, police next execute a search warrant on Adrian Griffin's property, namely his on-site research lab in the basement. But before they would get their answers, investigators would make one more startling break in the case upon searching the Oceanside home that would later become an active crime scene at 333 Celestial Drive. Adrian Griffin is miraculously found alive, having been bound and concealed behind a false wall in an unfinished area of the basement itself. And even further, after authorities recover the still-alive Griffin for medical attention, they make an even more shocking find in his basement laboratory of the home that would bring to light exactly how the murderous Tom Griffin pulled off his string of violent and aggressive crimes. As mentioned previously, Adrian Griffin had been an expert and what many considered to be a technological genius, specifically in the field of optics research. And at some point during his research phase, he had made a controversial and yet incredible advancement in a scientific development that his own research logs show he was planning on unveiling to the world only weeks after his initial supposed death. And this marvel of modern-day technology was quite simply a bodysuit. The numerous prototype outfits, as well as the working models discovered in the Griffin residence, were made up of high-resolution cameras and mirrored lenses, engineered and affixed to every square inch of these bodysuits in an almost honeycomb-shaped pattern. Now, the intricate design of the suit allowed the user to physically mirror their own surroundings through ray tracing technology built into the cameras themselves that would essentially record and then mimic the opposing images with remarkable precision and accuracy. Now, this would essentially render the wearer completely and utterly invisible. A no doubt remarkable leap in technology that would unfortunately be stolen and repurposed for far more ghastly intentions by stalker and killer Tom Griffin himself. It's ultimately theorized by police that Tom Griffin had staged his own brother's suicide, possibly drugging him to the point of slowing his heart rate just enough to appear deceased on the surface, and that Tom's own refusal of approving the medical autopsy of his brother's body was further evidence of his own implication in the crime, and that he wouldn't have wanted police to discover that Adrian was obviously still alive. It's theorized here that the motive behind Adrian's staged death, as well as his subsequent kidnapping and confinement, was likely that of a large inheritance that would have been procured after Adrian's death, and that his brother Tom Griffin had suspected that this money in question would actually be passed down to himself. It's suggested then that upon the discovery that these funds would instead be routed to abuse survivor Cecilia Cass, Tom Griffin expanded his own devious plans to prey on Cecilia, causing her own mental decline in the process, in the hopes that she would sign over this wealth and fortune to him after having her declared mentally unstable. Police believe at this point that Tom likely stole this advanced suit technology from the basement laboratory of the Griffin household, using it for no doubt unintended and murderous purposes that resulted in the terrifying stalking of Cecilia Cass and her friends, as well as the murder of her sister Emily. The case of the Invisible Man Killer raised some serious questions and also debates in the years since the case's conclusion, namely in the initial false implication of surviving abuse victim Cecilia Cass. Cecilia was ultimately cleared of any and all wrongdoing in the case and was rumored to have started a new life, now free of her abusers. And while Adrian Griffin was discovered and rescued by police, it wouldn't be long before his own story would prove to have a violent and shockingly ironic end. In what many attribute to the explosive public exposure of his extensive spousal abuse, coupled with the now breaking story of his brother's nefarious and heinous crimes, Adrian Griffin ultimately took his own life in the confines of his own home, officially putting an end to the Invisible Man investigation once and for all. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on The Invisible Man. I am a huge fan of the Universal monster flicks, my personal favorite being Creature from the Black Lagoon. So when news of this modern take of Invisible Man first came out, I was skeptical of the idea. That being said, I was pleasantly surprised by this take of a story that's been told many times over the years. Not only is the story well written, showcasing topics like the stigmas of abuse and the unrelenting resolve of its survivor, but it's capped off by some seriously strong acting from pretty much everybody in the movie, including an absolute powerhouse performance from lead actress Elizabeth Moss. I also thought the take of the Invisible Man being the product of a scientifically engineered suit was actually a really cool and interestingly fresh concept, providing a more grounded take on the titular villain in contrast to the more mad scientist invisible serums popularized in past iterations. The movie is also extremely well shot, with some amazing use of sound design and building tension, including plenty of suspenseful and lingering takes of what's quite literally an otherwise empty room other than maybe the protagonist, creating a truly profound sense of dread that the Invisible Man just might be lurking in there somewhere. Also, just to note, in the actual movie itself, it is Adrian Griffin who's the invisible stalker killer, and his brother Tom is actually an accomplice in the crimes. However, due to the way that the movie ends, with the main character Cecilia finally getting revenge on her abuser by using his own tech against him, and ironically framing it as a self-inflicted wound, I kept the true crime twist implicating the brother in the crimes, as from the police perspective in the movieverse, they wouldn't have actually known anything otherwise. And I always try to keep that in-universe narrative as best as I can for the podcast without making changes to the story. Speaking of, I'm excited to say that our bonus episode launches this Friday, where I'll be diving into some behind the scenes on the research and creation process of these true crime twists. It'll include some Easter egg references that you can actually watch if you ever go back and view the movies that we cover, as well as some of the intricate details and where they actually come from within some of the designated movies themselves. So if that sounds like something that might be interesting to you, be sure to check that out later this week and let us know what you think. As always, I'm your host Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.